The thunderous crack of lightning illuminated the night sky as Violet Lawson clung desperately to the frame of her modest homestead, watching in horror as flames licked at the edges of her property. The drought-stricken prairie had become kindling for the merciless fire that now threatened everything she had worked for since her father's passing 3 months prior. "Rusty, Rusty, where are you?" she screamed, her voice barely audible over the roaring flames and howling wind. The spring of 1875 had been unforgiving in the Nebraska territory. Too little rain, too much sun, and now this hellish nightmare of fire and brimstone. It was then she heard a desperate, panicked barking from the edge of the property where the flames were advancing most rapidly. Her loyal Irish setter, her only companion these past lonely months, was trapped near the burning barn. "No," Violet cried out, tying her apron around her face to shield from the smoke. She took one step toward the inferno when a strong hand clasped her arm. "Miss, you can't go out there." A deep voice commanded. Whirling around, Violet found herself staring into the concerned face of a tall man she'd never seen before. His face was smudged with soot, and beneath his wide-brimmed hat, keen eyes assessed the dangerous situation with practiced efficiency. "My dog is trapped," she cried, yanking her arm away. "I have to save Rusty." The stranger tilted his hat back, revealing more of his weathered face. "I'm Preston Zachary, miss. I was passing through when I saw the fire." He glanced toward the desperate barking. "Her dog barked at the fire's edge," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Then, with a decisive nod, the cowboy said, "We'll save him together." Before Violet could respond, he grabbed a wet blanket from her porch water barrel. "Stay close behind me. Cover your mouth and nose. When I say run, you run to the dog, grab him, and get back here." "Understand." Violet nodded, tears streaming down her ash-stained face. Preston moved with surprising speed for such a tall man. He held the wet blanket before them like a shield as they approached the burning barn. The heat was unbearable, the air thick with smoke and embers. "There." Violet pointed toward a small opening beneath the barn's foundation where Rusty was desperately trying to escape, his reddish coat visible even through the smoke. The dog's barking grew more frantic at the sight of his mistress. "Ready?" Preston yelled over the crackling flames. Now, Violet darted forward, the wet cloth pressed against her face. She dropped to her knees, reaching into the small opening. "Come, Rusty, come, boy." The terrified animal scrambled toward her, and she grabbed his collar, pulling him free. Just as she did, a burning beam crashed down where the dog had been seconds before. "Run," Preston shouted, using the blanket to shield them from a shower of embers as they retreated from the inferno. They made it back to the relative safety of the yard, all three of them coughing and gasping for clean air. Rusty trembled against Violet's legs, whining softly. "Thank you," Violet managed between coughs. "You saved him." Preston nodded grimly, his attention already back on the fire. "The barn's lost, but we might save your house if we work fast. You got neighbors who can help." Violet shook her head. "Nearest farm is 5 miles east. Then it's just us." He handed her a bucket. "Fill this at the pump. I'll grab what tools I can find. This is going to be a long night, miss." "Lawson, Violet Lawson." Something in his eyes changed at the mention of her name, but he quickly looked away. "Well, Miss Lawson, let's get to work." For the next 3 hours, they fought the fire with every ounce of strength they possessed. Preston dug fire breaks while Violet hauled water. They beat at flames with wet blankets, moved what livestock remained to safety, and watched with weary relief as the wind finally shifted, pushing the fire away from the homestead. By dawn, they stood exhausted but triumphant. The barn was nothing but charred timbers, and a portion of her cornfield was destroyed. But her modest home still stood, and most importantly, Rusty lay safely at her feet, his tail thumping weakly against the ground. "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Zachary," Violet said, pushing a strand of soot-blackened hair from her face. Preston removed his hat, revealing a shock of dark hair streaked with premature silver at the temples. "No need for thanks. Anyone would have done the same." "Not anyone would have risked their life for a stranger and her dog," she countered, studying him more carefully in the morning light. He was older than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30 to her 23 years, with lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and hardship. "Where were you headed before the fire?" she asked, suddenly aware of how inappropriate it was to be alone with a strange man even under these circumstances. "Nowhere particular." His answer was clipped, his gaze shifting to the horizon, just passing through. "Well, you're welcome to rest here before you continue your journey. It's the least I can offer." Violet gestured to the house. "I can make breakfast." Preston looked like he might refuse, but then Rusty nudged his hand with a wet nose, and the cowboy's stern expression softened slightly. "I reckon your dog has voted for me to stay," he said with the faintest hint of a smile, "at least until I'm sure the fire won't circle back. Then it's settled." Violet straightened her shoulders, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance. "I'll fix us something to eat while you see to your horse." As she turned toward the house, she heard him murmur, "Much obliged, Miss Lawson." Violet couldn't explain the flutter in her chest at those simple words, nor the strange feeling that her life had somehow irrevocably changed in the span of one terrible, wonderful night. Inside her small kitchen, Violet pumped fresh water into a basin and quickly washed her face and hands. She caught a glimpse of herself in the small mirror hanging near the door and almost didn't recognize the woman staring back at her. Her normally neat auburn hair was a tangled mess, her face smudged with soot, and her dress, her best everyday dress, was ruined beyond repair. With a sigh, she quickly changed into her spare dress and tied a clean apron around her waist. There wasn't time to properly wash or pin up her hair, so she simply brushed it out and tied it back with a ribbon. It wasn't proper to receive a gentleman with her hair down, but given the circumstances, propriety seemed the least of her concerns. By the time Preston entered the house, Violet had coffee brewing on the stove and was frying bacon in her cast iron skillet. She'd also managed to mix up a batch of biscuits, which were now baking in the oven. "Something smells mighty fine," Preston said, removing his hat as he stepped through the doorway. He'd taken time to wash up at the pump outside, and his face was now clean of soot, revealing a strong jaw darkened with stubble. "It's nothing fancy, I'm afraid," Violet replied, gesturing for him to sit at the small wooden table. "Bacon, biscuits, and coffee. I'd offer eggs, but I haven't checked the henhouse yet to see what survived." Preston sat down, placing his hat on an empty chair. "This is a feast compared to what I've been eating on the trail." As Violet brought plates to the table, she noticed a long scar running from Preston's temple down to his jawline, partially hidden by his dark hair. He caught her looking and turned slightly, obscuring it from view. "How long have you lived out here alone, Miss Lawson?" he asked, clearly changing the subject before she could inquire about the scar. Violet poured coffee into 2 chipped cups before answering. "I wasn't always alone. My father and I worked this land for nearly 10 years after we came out from Pennsylvania. He passed this past winter, pneumonia." She swallowed hard against the familiar lump in her throat. "It's been just me and Rusty since January." Preston's expression softened. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," she said quietly, sitting across from him. "What about you, Mr. Zachary? Where do you call home?" Something dark flashed across his face. "Nowhere these days. I was a Texas Ranger for a time, then rode with a cattle outfit out of Wyoming. Now I just drift where the wind takes me." Violet sensed there was much more to his story, but she didn't press. Instead, she passed him the plate of bacon. "Well, the wind brought you here just when I needed help most. That makes you either very lucky or very blessed." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I haven't been called either in a long time, Miss Lawson." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, the only sounds being the clink of cutlery against plates and Rusty's occasional snuffling as he lay at Violet's feet. The dog had been washed and examined, and aside from some singed fur and minor burns on his paws, he had emerged from the fire relatively unscathed. "Your land," Preston finally said, breaking the silence. "How much of it was damaged?" Violet sighed, pushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "The barn is gone, of course, and maybe a quarter of my corn crop. The fire seemed to burn itself out at the creek bed to the west, so the pasture land is mostly intact." She stared into her coffee cup. I can rebuild the barn, but losing part of the crop will make for a lean winter. Preston nodded, his brow furrowed in thought. You've got a good piece of land here, rich soil, clean water. My father chose well, Violet agreed. He always said a man could make something of himself out here if he wasn't afraid of hard work. And what about a woman? Preston asked, his blue eyes studying her with unexpected intensity. Violet met his gaze squarely. A woman can do anything a man can do, Mr. Zachary. It just takes her twice as long because she has to prove herself first. To her surprise, Preston laughed a warm, genuine sound that transformed his serious face. I don't doubt that for a second, Miss Lawson. The moment was interrupted by a sharp bark from Rusty, who suddenly bolted upright and ran to the door. A moment later, Violet heard the sound of approaching horses. Preston was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to his hip where Violet now noticed a holstered revolver. Expecting company, she shook her head, rising from her chair. No, but it could be neighbors who saw the smoke. Together they moved to the front window. 3 riders were approaching the house, their horses kicking up dust in the morning sunlight. Do you recognize them? Preston asked, his voice suddenly tense. Violet squinted against the glare. The one in front looks like Sheriff Miller from town. The others? She trailed off, not recognizing the 2 men flanking the sheriff. Preston's expression darkened. I should go. Why? Violet asked, surprised by his sudden change in demeanor. If it's the sheriff, there's no need to worry, he's a good man. But Preston was already reaching for his hat. Miss Lawson, I thank you for your hospitality, but it's best I move on. Before Violet could protest further, Sheriff Miller's voice called out from the yard. Miss Lawson, you all right in there? We saw the fire from town. I'm fine, Sheriff. She called back, stepping onto the porch. The barn's gone, but the house is safe. Sheriff Miller dismounted, his weathered face creased with concern. Thank the Lord for that. We came as soon as we could. His eyes narrowed as Preston emerged from the house behind Violet. And who might you be, mister? Violet quickly explained. This is Mr. Zachary. He was passing by when the fire started. He helped save Rusty and kept the fire from reaching the house. I don't know what I would have done without him. The sheriff studied Preston with careful eyes. That right. Well, I suppose thanks are in order then. He extended his hand. Tom Miller, sheriff of Clearwater. Preston hesitated a moment before shaking the offered hand. Preston Zachary, one of the men still mounted, shifted in his saddle. Zachary, you say, from where? Here and there, Preston replied evenly. I don't stay in one place long. The mounted man exchanged a look with his companion that made Violet uneasy. Sheriff Miller seemed to sense the tension and quickly changed the subject. Miss Lawson, I brought along Mr. Jenkins and Mr. Thornton here to help assess the damage and see what can be salvaged. Town's planning a barn raising for you next week. Violet felt a rush of gratitude. That's very kind, Sheriff. Neighbors help neighbors out here, Miller said simply. Now, why don't you show us what we're dealing with? As Violet led the sheriff toward the remains of the barn, she noticed Preston hanging back, his posture rigid. When she glanced over her shoulder, she saw him deep in conversation with the 2 other men, their expressions serious. Something wasn't right. She could feel it in the sudden change in atmosphere, see it in the way Preston's hand hovered near his gun. But before she could return to his side, Sheriff Miller was asking her questions about the fire, drawing her attention away. By the time she finished explaining everything to the sheriff, Preston and his horse were nowhere to be seen. Where did Mr. Zachary go? She asked, trying to keep the disappointment from her voice. Sheriff Miller's expression was unreadable. Said he had pressing business elsewhere. Drifters like that, they don't usually stay put for long. Violet couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Preston's sudden departure than simple restlessness. But with the remains of her barn still smoldering and the reality of her situation setting in, she had no choice but to put the mysterious cowboy out of her mind and focus on what needed to be done. Still, as she and Rusty stood watching Sheriff Miller and his men ride back toward town with promises to return with supplies and help, she found herself scanning the horizon, half hoping to catch a glimpse of a lone rider. But the prairie stretched empty in all directions. and Preston Zachary had vanished as suddenly as he had appeared. Over the next few days, Violet threw herself into the work of salvaging what she could from the barn and tending to her damaged fields. True to the sheriff's word, neighbors from miles around came to help, bringing food, supplies, and willing hands. It was a reminder of why she loved this harsh but beautiful land and the sturdy people who called it home. On the fourth day after the fire, as Violet was hanging laundry on the line behind her house, Rusty suddenly perked up his ears and let out a joyful bark. Before she could stop him, he was racing toward the road, tail wagging furiously. Shading her eyes against the afternoon sun, Violet's heart skipped a beat when she recognized the rider approaching her homestead. Preston Zachary rode tall in the saddle, his dark hat pulled low over his eyes. Behind him, he led a second horse loaded with what appeared to be lumber and supplies. "Look who's back, Rusty," Violet murmured, trying to ignore the flutter of excitement in her chest. She smoothed her hair, wishing she had worn something nicer than her old work dress and worn boots. Preston dismounted with easy grace, bending to ruffle Rusty's ears before straightening to face Violet. "Miss Lawson," he greeted, removing his hat. "Mr. Zachary," she replied, suddenly feeling shy. "I thought you'd moved on," he gestured to the loaded horse behind him. "I had some business to attend to. Thought you might be able to use these for rebuilding." Violet approached, her eyes widening at the quality and quantity of the lumber he'd brought. "This must have cost a small fortune." Preston shrugged. "Found a good deal." She looked at him skeptically. "Did you now?" A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Let's just say I came into some unexpected funds and wanted to put them to good use." Before she could question him further, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Violet recognized Sheriff Miller's bay gelding among the riders. "Seems your neighbors have arrived for that barn raising," Preston observed. Indeed, a group of about 15 men were heading toward the homestead, wagons loaded with supplies trailing behind them. Violet saw familiar faces among them, the Andersons from the next farm over, Mr. Peterson, who ran the general store in town, even old Dr. Green, who rarely left his practice. "Will you stay?" she asked, turning back to Preston. "They could use your help." He hesitated, glancing at the approaching group. "I'm not sure that's wise." "Please," Violet said, surprising herself with the intensity of her request. At least for today, something in her expression must have swayed him, for he finally nodded. "For today." The barn raising became a community affair, with women bringing food while men worked under the hot sun to erect the new structure. Preston worked alongside them, keeping mostly to himself, but proving to be skilled with both hammer and saw. More than once, Violet caught Sheriff Miller watching Preston with a thoughtful expression, but the lawman made no move to approach the mysterious cowboy. As the sun began to set, the frame of the new barn stood proudly against the darkening sky. It would take several more days to complete, but the progress was remarkable. "We'll finish up tomorrow," Sheriff Miller announced, wiping sweat from his brow. "Miss Lawson, you'll have a new barn before week's end, mark my words." Violet thanked everyone profusely as they gathered their tools and prepared to depart. Preston remained by the new barn, securing tools and tidying up, clearly avoiding the gathering crowd. When only Sheriff Miller remained, he approached Violet with a serious expression. "Miss Lawson, might I have a word with you? In private?" Violet nodded, leading him a short distance from the house. "What is it, Sheriff?" Miller glanced toward Preston before speaking in a low voice. "I feel it's my duty to warn you about your friend over there, Mr. Zachary." "Yes." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "I've been making some inquiries. He's not just some drifter passing through. There are wanted posters with his name on them in 3 territories." Violet felt a chill despite the warm evening. "What for?" "Murder, among other things." Miller's expression was grim. "They say he killed a man in cold blood down in Colorado. There's also talk of him running with the Carson gang a few years back." "I don't believe it," Violet said instinctively, though the pieces suddenly fit Preston's reluctance around the law, his mysterious scar, his sudden departure, and equally sudden return. "He saved my life, Sheriff, and Rusty's." "Maybe so," Miller conceded. But a good deed doesn't wash away a man's past. I'm telling you this for your own safety, Miss Lawson. Be careful around him." After the sheriff departed, Violet stood frozen, her mind reeling with this new information. Could the man who had risked his life to save her dog truly be a murderer? A criminal? She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear Preston approach until he spoke. The sheriff had quite a lot to say, he observed quietly. Violet turned, startled. "You heard, not the words, but I know what he told you." Preston's face was carefully neutral. "You want to know if it's true?" It wasn't a question, but Violet nodded anyway. Preston looked past her toward the open prairie bathed in twilight. "Some of it is, some isn't. The man I killed in Colorado drew on me first. It was him or me." His voice was flat, emotionless. "As for the Carson gang, I rode with them for 6 months before I realized what they really were. I left, but not before some of their crimes were pinned on me too." "Why are you telling me this?" Violet asked, her voice barely above a whisper. His eyes met hers, direct and unflinching. "Because you deserve the truth, and because I'm leaving at first light and I wanted you to know why." "You don't have to go," she said, surprising herself. Preston gave a bitter laugh. "Sheriff Miller's a good man, but he's also a lawman. He might look the other way for a day or two out of gratitude for helping you, but sooner or later he'll do his duty, and I don't aim to be around when he does." Violet stepped closer to him, emboldened by emotions she couldn't quite name. "What if I asked you to stay?" For a moment, something vulnerable flashed in Preston's eyes, but it was quickly masked. "You don't know what you're asking, Miss Lawson." "I know exactly what I'm asking," she countered. "I'm asking the man who saved my dog and my home to consider that maybe, just maybe, he deserves a second chance." Preston shook his head. "Second chances are rare in this life, especially for men like me." "Then maybe it's time you found one," Violet persisted. "The barn needs finishing. The north field needs plowing, and She hesitated, then plunged ahead. "I could use a friend out here." Their eyes locked, and for a moment Violet thought he might agree, but then he stepped back, breaking the connection. "I'll stay until the barn is finished, that's all I can promise." It wasn't the answer she wanted, but it was a reprieve from his imminent departure. "Thank you," she said softly. Preston nodded once, then turned toward the small tent he'd set up at the edge of her property. "Good night, Miss Lawson." As she watched him walk away, Violet wondered what it said about her that she was willing to overlook a man's past based on nothing more than a feeling in her heart and the memory of how gently he had handled her frightened dog. The next morning, Violet woke to the sound of hammering. Dressing quickly, she stepped outside to find Preston already at work on the barn, driving nails with focused precision. Rusty lay nearby, watching his every move with undisguised adoration. "You're up early," she called, walking toward him with a cup of coffee in hand. Preston paused, wiping sweat from his brow despite the early hour. "Thought I'd get a head start before the others arrive." Violet handed him the coffee. "I appreciate the effort, but you shouldn't work yourself to exhaustion." He accepted the cup with a nod of thanks. "Hard work keeps a man honest. Is that what you're trying to be?" she asked boldly. "Honest?" Preston's eyes met hers over the rim of the cup. "I'm trying, Miss Lawson. That's all any of us can do." Before she could respond, the sound of approaching wagons announced the arrival of her neighbors. The day passed in a blur of activity, with the barn taking shape under the skillful hands of the community. Preston worked tirelessly alongside them, and Violet couldn't help but notice how several of the men sought his advice on technical matters, recognizing his expertise despite Sheriff Miller's obvious wariness. By sunset, the barn was nearly complete, lacking only a few finishing touches that would be added the following day. As the workers departed, many clapped Preston on the back or shook his hand, apparently having decided that any man who worked so hard to help a neighbor couldn't be all bad, regardless of rumors. Violet prepared a simple supper, and to her surprise, Preston accepted her invitation to eat at the house rather than retreating to his tent. "The barn looks wonderful," she said as they ate by lamplight. "Better than the original, if I'm being honest." Preston allowed himself a small smile. "It's solid, should withstand the next fire if it comes." "Let's hope it doesn't," Violet replied with feeling. "One such experience is enough for a lifetime." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Preston spoke again. Sheriff Miller says there's a stage leaving for Omaha the day after tomorrow, says he can arrange passage for me. Violet set down her fork. You're still determined to leave then, it's for the best. His voice was gentle but firm. Your neighbors have been kind considering, but I don't belong here. Where do you belong then? She challenged. Moving from place to place, always looking over your shoulder, Preston's expression hardened slightly. It's the life I've chosen. Or the life that's chosen you, Violet countered. There are other options, Mr. Zachary, such as, Violet hesitated, knowing her next words might change everything. Such as staying here, working this land with me. Preston stared at her, clearly stunned by the suggestion. Miss Lawson, I don't think you understand what you're proposing. I understand perfectly, she insisted. I'm proposing a business arrangement. You need a place to stop running. I need help with this farm. It's nothing more complicated than that. But even as she said the words, Violet knew they were only partially true. There was something more between them, something unspoken but growing stronger with each passing day. She could see in his eyes that he felt it too. Your reputation would be ruined, he said finally. An unmarried woman living with a man of questionable character, the gossip alone would destroy you. Violet lifted her chin. I've never much cared for gossip. You should, he countered. Out here, a woman's reputation is everything. They fell into tense silence, the only sound being Rusty's contented snoring from his place by the stove. Finally, Preston sighed. Miss Lawson, Violet, I can't pretend I'm not tempted by your offer, but I've spent the last 5 years making enemies and mistakes. Sooner or later, those mistakes catch up to a man. And when they do, Violet said softly, wouldn't it be better to face them with someone by your side? Their eyes met across the table, and for a moment the barriers between them seemed to dissolve. Then, abruptly, Preston stood. Thank you for supper, he said formally. I should turn in, early start tomorrow. Violet watched him leave, frustration and something deeper, more complicated, churning inside her. She had never been one to throw caution to the wind, had always been the sensible daughter, the responsible woman. Yet here she was, practically begging a man with a price on his head to stay with her. What would her father say if he could see her now? The thought of her father brought tears to her eyes. James Lawson had been a pragmatic man, but also a believer in seeing beyond appearances to a person's true character. Judge a man by his actions, not his reputation, he used to say. Reputations can be built on lies, but actions never lie. Preston Zachary had saved her dog, helped save her home, and worked without complaint to rebuild her barn. Whatever his past contained, his actions since arriving at her homestead had been nothing but honorable. With sudden resolve, Violet stood and called for Rusty. Together they walked out into the cool night air, heading for the small tent at the edge of her property. Preston emerged at her approach, his hand instinctively going to his gun until he recognized her. Violet, is something wrong? No, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. But I have something to say, and I need you to listen. He studied her face in the moonlight, then nodded. I'm listening. Violet took a deep breath. My father always told me that a person's true character shows in a crisis. When the fire came, when Rusty was trapped, you didn't hesitate. You risked your life for a stranger and her dog. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. Preston remained silent, his expression unreadable. I don't know what you've done in the past, Violet continued, and frankly, I don't care. I care about who you are now, the man standing before me, and that man deserves a chance at a new beginning. She stepped closer, her heart pounding. I'm not asking for promises. I'm not asking for anything except that you consider staying, at least for a while. Help me with the spring planting. See if this land speaks to you the way it does to me. Preston's voice was rough when he finally spoke. And if it doesn't, if I bring nothing but trouble to your door, then you'll go and I'll manage, just as I was managing before you arrived. Violet reached out impulsively and took his hand. But what if it does? What if this is where you're meant to be? For a long moment, Preston stared at their joined hands. Then, slowly, his fingers tightened around hers. One season, he said quietly. I'll stay through the spring planting. After that, we'll see. Relief and joy flooded through Violet. "One season," she agreed. As they stood there in the moonlight, Rusty pressed against their legs as if sealing the pact between them. Violet couldn't help but wonder what the coming months would bring. She only knew that for the first time since her father's death, she felt a spark of hope for the future, a future that somehow, against all odds, now included Preston Zachary. The spring planting season passed in a blur of backbreaking work and unexpected moments of joy. Preston proved to be a skilled farmer, drawing on knowledge he claimed to have gained during a brief stint working a farm in Kansas, between other jobs. Under his guidance, Violet's fields were plowed, planted, and tended with an efficiency that would have made her father proud. The new barn stood strong and sturdy, housing not only Violet's small collection of livestock, but also the 2 additional horses Preston had somehow acquired, though he remained vague about their origins. Rusty appointed himself Preston's constant shadow, following the tall cowboy everywhere, much to Violet's amusement. "That dog's loyalty can be bought with a few scraps of bacon," she teased one evening as they sat on the porch after supper, watching the sun set over the fields. Preston scratched behind Rusty's ears. "Smart animal knows quality when he sees it. Is that so?" Violet laughed. "And here I thought he just had poor judgment." Preston's mouth quirked in the half-smile that had become more frequent over the weeks. "You might be right about that. He seems fond of both of us, after all." Their eyes met, and Violet felt the now familiar flutter in her chest. Living and working together had created a comfortable routine between them, but there remained an unspoken tension, a careful distance they both maintained despite their growing closeness. Sheriff Miller visited occasionally, always with a watchful eye on Preston, but even he seemed to be warming to the former outlaw's presence. The fact that no wanted posters had appeared in Clearwater bearing Preston's likeness was a small miracle that neither Violet nor Preston discussed openly. As April turned to May and then June, the agreed-upon one season was drawing to a close. Violet found herself watching Preston more carefully, looking for signs that he was preparing to leave. But if anything, he seemed to be putting down roots, repairing fences, planning improvements to the chicken coop, discussing the possibility of expanding the cornfield next year. Still, they hadn't spoken about what would happen when their agreement ended, and Violet was afraid to broach the subject, fearing the answer. The decision was forced upon them one scorching afternoon in late June. Preston and Violet were working together in the vegetable garden when the sound of approaching riders caught their attention. Rusty, who had been dozing in the shade, leapt to his feet with a warning bark. Preston straightened, his hand instinctively moving to the gun he still wore despite the months of peaceful farm work. "Expecting visitors?" Violet shook her head, shading her eyes against the sun. "No, but it could be the Andersons, Mrs. Anderson mentioned stopping by with some raspberry preserves." But as the riders drew closer, it became clear this was no social call. 4 men, heavily armed and riding hard, were approaching the homestead. Preston's face went pale, then hardened. "Get inside," he ordered, his voice suddenly that of a stranger, cold, commanding. "Preston, what now, Violet?" He gave her a gentle push toward the house. "And keep Rusty with you." Reluctantly, Violet retreated to the porch, calling for the dog to follow. But she refused to go inside, instead watching anxiously as Preston walked out to meet the approaching riders, his posture tense but his movements deliberately casual. The men reined in their horses a short distance from the house, dust billowing around them. Violet could see their faces now, hard men with cold eyes and weathered skin that spoke of years spent in the elements. "Well, look what we found, boys," the leader called, a tall man with a shock of gray hair and a vicious scar across his nose. "Preston Zachary, playing farmer." "Never thought I'd see the day," Preston's voice carried clearly across the yard. "What do you want, Rollins?" The man called Rollins chuckled, the sound devoid of humor. "Is that any way to greet an old friend, after all we've been through together?" "We were never friends," Preston replied evenly. "State your business and move on. You're not welcome here." Rollins dismounted, his eyes flicking toward the porch where Violet stood. Pretty place you've got, pretty company too, he turned back to Preston. We're here about the money, Zach. The money you took, that wasn't yours to take. Violet felt her blood run cold, so there was truth to the stories about Preston after all. That money was blood money, Preston said, his voice hard. Payment for a job I never agreed to. Maybe so, Rollins conceded with a shrug. But Carson wants it back, all of it. Send me back empty-handed and he'll come himself. You know what that means. Preston was silent for a long moment. I don't have it all, I used some of it, Rollins smirked. On what, seed corn and chicken feed? He gestured expansively at the farm. Building a little love nest with your lady friend there? Leave her out of this, Preston warned, his hand hovering near his gun. Too late for that, Rollins replied. She's already in it just by harboring you. Carson might decide she knows too much. The threat hung in the air like a thundercloud. Preston's next words chilled Violet to the bone. I'll go with you, just leave the farm and her alone. No, the word escaped Violet before she could stop herself. She rushed down the porch steps, Rusty at her heels, ignoring Preston's furious glance. Well, well, Rollins said, his eyes raking over Violet. The lady has spirit. This is my land, Violet said firmly, coming to stand beside Preston. And you're trespassing. I suggest you leave now before I fetch my shotgun, one of Rollins' men laughed. Hear that, boys? The little lady's going to shoot us. I wouldn't test her, Preston said quietly. She's a better shot than you might think. Violet felt a rush of gratitude for the lie. While she could handle her father's old shotgun in an emergency, she was hardly the marksman Preston was implying. Rollins studied them both for a moment, then nodded slowly. All right, Zach, here's the deal. You've got 1 week to get the money together, all of it. I'll be back, and if you're not here with the cash, we'll burn this pretty farm to the ground with or without you and your woman in it. With that, he remounted his horse. 1 week, he repeated, then signaled to his men. They wheeled their horses around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. As soon as they were out of sight, Preston turned to Violet, his expression a mixture of anger and fear. I told you to stay inside and let you sacrifice yourself, she countered. What were you thinking, offering to go with them? I was thinking about keeping you safe. Preston ran a hand through his hair in frustration. This is exactly what I was afraid would happen, my past catching up to us. What did he mean about money? Violet asked. The lumber you brought for the barn. Preston couldn't meet her eyes. Yes, it was part of what I took from the Carson gang before I left, money they'd earned from robbery and worse. And you used it to help rebuild my barn, Violet said softly. I thought I was putting blood money to good use. Preston's laugh was bitter. Instead, I've painted a target on your back. Violet reached for his hand. We'll figure this out. Preston pulled away. There's nothing to figure out. I'm leaving tonight and I'm taking their trouble with me. No. Violet protested. That's exactly what they want. They'll follow you, kill you, and then come back here anyway. Not if they believe you had nothing to do with me, Preston argued. I can lead them away from here, make them think the money is elsewhere. Violet shook her head vehemently. I won't let you do that. This is your home now, too. The words hung between them, potent and undeniable. Preston stared at her, something vulnerable flickering in his eyes. Violet. No, she said again, more gently this time. We face this together just like we faced the fire. Remember what you said when Rusty was trapped. We'll save him together. Now it's time for me to help save you. Preston looked as though he might argue further, but instead he sighed deeply. You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met. Thank you, Violet replied with the ghost of a smile. Now let's go inside and figure out exactly how much money you have left and what we're going to do about these men. As they walked toward the house, Rusty trotting beside them, Violet slipped her hand into Preston's. After a moment's hesitation, his fingers closed around hers, warm and reassuring despite the danger that loomed ahead. Whatever came next, they would face it side by side. Inside the house, Preston retrieved a metal box hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the small room he had been using. He opened it on the kitchen table, revealing several bundles of bills. This is what's left, he said grimly. About half of what Rollins is expecting. Violet sat across from him, trying to hide her shock at the amount. It was more money than she had ever seen in one place. Could we get the rest? I have some savings, and perhaps we could borrow from the bank in town. Preston shook his head. This isn't your responsibility, Violet, and even if we could get the money, there's no guarantee Rollins would keep his word. Men like him and Carson don't operate on honor. Then what do we do? She asked. Preston was quiet for a long moment, his face troubled. There's only one real solution. I need to get word to the marshals about Carson's whereabouts. If they can capture him and his gang, Rollins' threats become meaningless. But how? The nearest marshal's office is in Lincoln, 3 days' ride from here. I know someone who can get a message there faster, Preston said. A former ranger who owes me a favor. He runs a way station about 20 miles north of here. Violet nodded slowly. So you'll go there, send the message, and then what? Wait for the marshals while Rollins and his men come back here looking for you. No, Preston said firmly. Once I've sent the message, I'll lead them away from here, make them think I'm running with the money. Absolutely not, Violet stood, her hands flat on the table. I won't let you use yourself as bait. It's the only way to keep you safe, Preston insisted. And what about keeping you safe? Violet demanded. Doesn't that matter to me? Or do you think so little of yourself that you believe your life is worth less than mine? Preston stared at her, clearly taken aback by her vehemence. Violet, I'm trying to protect what matters most to me. And so am I, she replied softly. Their eyes held across the table, the unspoken feelings between them finally surfacing. Preston was the first to look away. We need help, he admitted. Someone we can trust, Violet thought for a moment. Sheriff Miller. Preston looked skeptical. The man who knows I'm wanted in 3 territories. He'd be more likely to arrest me than help me. I don't think so, Violet said. He's been watching you these past months. He's seen how you've worked, how you've changed. She hesitated, then added, besides, he cares about this community. He won't want Carson's gang bringing trouble here any more than we do. After much debate, they agreed that Violet would ride into town the next morning to speak with Sheriff Miller, while Preston would prepare for whatever might come next. That night, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies dance in the gathering darkness, Rusty's head resting on Preston's boot, the weight of their situation seemed momentarily lifted. Did you mean what you said earlier? Preston asked quietly. About this being my home too. Violet looked at him in the dim light, taking in the strong profile that had become so dear to her. Yes, she said simply. I meant it. Preston turned to face her, his expression unusually open. When I first stopped here that night, I never imagined this. He gestured to the farm around them, to Rusty, to the space between them that had grown so comfortably small. I never thought I could have a place again, somewhere to belong. Violet's heart swelled. Do you belong here, I mean? Preston was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. Then softly, yes, more than I've belonged anywhere since I was a boy. Then we'll fight for it, Violet said with determination. Whatever it takes. Preston reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. Whatever it takes, he echoed. They sat in silence after that, watching the stars emerge one by one, their hands still joined. Rusty sighed contentedly in his sleep, oblivious to the danger that threatened his peaceful world. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for tonight, they had this moment of quiet togetherness, a small victory in itself. The next morning dawned clear and hot, promising another scorching day. Violet dressed carefully in her best riding skirt and blouse, determined to present a respectable appearance when meeting with Sheriff Miller. Preston, meanwhile, checked and rechecked his weapons, his expression growing more grim with each passing hour. I'll be back by midday, Violet promised as she mounted her mare. Try not to do anything reckless while I'm gone. Preston's mouth quirked in a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. I'll just be here preparing for war. That's not funny, she chided, though she appreciated his attempt at lightness. It wasn't meant to be, he replied soberly. Be careful, Violet. Trust your instincts. If anything feels wrong in town, I know, she assured him. I'll turn around and come straight back. With a final nod, Violet urged her horse forward, Rusty following faithfully at her heels despite Preston's attempts to call him back. That dog's chosen his loyalty, Preston called after them. "He's just making sure I come back," Violet called over her shoulder with a smile. The ride into Clearwater took just over an hour, the town coming into view as a dusty collection of wooden buildings shimmering in the heat. Despite its small size, Clearwater had grown considerably since Violet had arrived with her father 10 years earlier. There was now a proper hotel, a bank, and several shops in addition to the saloon and general store that had been the town's only businesses back then. Violet headed straight for the sheriff's office, tying her horse at the hitching post outside and instructing Rusty to stay. The dog obediently sat in the shade, though his expression suggested he'd rather explore the interesting smells of town. Sheriff Miller looked up in surprise when Violet entered his office. "Miss Lawson, this is unexpected." He rose from behind his desk, gesturing to a chair. "Is everything all right at your place?" "Not exactly, Sheriff," Violet replied, taking the offered seat. "I need your help." For the next quarter hour, Violet explained the situation Preston's past with the Carson gang, the money he'd taken, and Rollins' threats. She carefully omitted certain details, such as how long Preston had been staying at her farm, presenting their relationship as that of a temporary employer and hired hand. Sheriff Miller listened without interruption, his weathered face giving little away. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, regarding her thoughtfully. "Miss Lawson, I appreciate your honesty, but you should know that harboring a known outlaw is a serious offense." "Is he a known outlaw, Sheriff?" Violet challenged. "Or is he a man trying to make amends for past mistakes?" "You've seen him these past months. Has he done anything to harm this community?" Miller sighed, rubbing his chin. "No, he's been a model citizen far as I can tell, but that doesn't erase what came before." "Perhaps not," Violet conceded. "But shouldn't a man be judged by who he is now rather than who he was?" "That's a philosophical question for preachers, not sheriffs," Miller replied, though his tone had softened. "But I take your point." He stood, pacing to the window. "The Carson gang is bad business, Miss Lawson, real bad. If they've set their sights on your place." "That's why we need your help," Violet pressed. "Preston wants to contact the marshals, let them know where to find Carson, but in the meantime, Rollins and his men will be coming back." Sheriff Miller turned to face her. "When?" "5 days from now." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Not much time." He seemed to be weighing something in his mind. "Miss Lawson, I'll help you not for Zachary's sake, but for yours and for the safety of this community. I'll telegraph the marshal's office myself, but you should know they'll want Zachary too." Violet's heart sank. Even if he helps them catch Carson, might reduce his sentence, Miller allowed, but he'll still have to answer for his past. The thought of Preston in prison or worse sent a chill through Violet despite the warm day. What if there was another way? What if he could earn a pardon by helping bring down Carson? Sheriff Miller's expression was skeptical. "That would take some doing, and influence I don't have." "But the marshals might," Violet persisted. "Especially if Carson is as dangerous as you say." The sheriff considered this. "I can include it in my telegram. No promises, though." He reached for his hat. "I'll ride with you back to your place. Need to get a statement from Zachary anyway, and I'd like to see the layout of your farm. If Rollins is coming with force, we'll need to prepare." Relief flooded through Violet. "Thank you, Sheriff, truly." As they left the office, Miller paused. "Miss Lawson, one more thing. Your relationship with Zachary, it seems to go beyond employer and employee." Violet felt her cheeks warm. "I don't see how that's relevant to the current situation." "Maybe it's not," Miller conceded, "but I'd hate to see you hurt physically or otherwise." "I appreciate your concern," Violet replied stiffly, "but I'm quite capable of making my own decisions." The sheriff nodded, a glint of something like respect in his eyes. "That you are, Miss Lawson." "That you are." The ride back to the farm was tense, with Sheriff Miller asking occasional questions about the property's layout and defensible positions. It was clear he was taking the threat seriously, which both relieved and terrified Violet. If the seasoned lawman was concerned, the danger must be very real indeed. Preston was waiting on the porch when they arrived, his posture rigid at the sight of the sheriff. Rusty, who had run ahead, was already circling excitedly around his legs. Miss Lawson explained the situation, Sheriff Miller said without preamble as he dismounted. I've agreed to help, but I'll need your full cooperation, Zachary. Preston's eyes flicked to Violet, who nodded encouragingly. You have it, he replied cautiously. Good, show me around your property. I want to see all approaches, any natural barriers, places where men might take cover. As the men walked the perimeter of the farm, discussing strategy in low voices, Violet busied herself preparing a meal. The normality of the task peeling potatoes, kneading dough for biscuits helped calm her racing thoughts. By the time they returned, a plan was taking shape. Sheriff Miller would telegraph the marshal's office that afternoon, requesting urgent assistance. In the meantime, he would deputize several trustworthy men from town to help defend the farm when Rollins returned. What about Preston? Violet asked as they sat around the kitchen table, the remains of lunch pushed aside. Sheriff Miller's expression was unreadable. I've included a request for consideration of a pardon in exchange for his cooperation. Can't promise anything, but Carson's a big enough fish that they might agree. Preston, who had been mostly silent throughout the meal, finally spoke. And if they don't, the sheriff met his gaze directly. Then after this is over, I'll have to take you in. That's the deal. Preston nodded, his face grim but resigned. Fair enough. After Sheriff Miller departed, promising to return the following day with news from the marshal's office, Violet found Preston in the barn, methodically cleaning his revolver. You didn't have to do this, he said without looking up. Involving the law, risking everything. Yes, I did, Violet replied simply, sitting beside him on a bale of hay. Because you matter to me. This place, what we've built here together, it matters. Preston finally looked at her, his expression a mixture of wonder and sadness. Violet Lawson, you are the most remarkable woman I've ever known. She smiled despite the fear that had been her constant companion since Rollins' arrival. Remarkable enough that you'll stop trying to sacrifice yourself and start fighting to stay here, with me, with you, he repeated softly. Then, with a decisiveness that took her breath away, he leaned forward and kissed her. It was their first kiss, gentle but sure, as if he'd been waiting months for this moment. Perhaps he had been. Violet certainly had, though she'd barely admitted it to herself. When they broke apart, Preston rested his forehead against hers. If there's any chance at all of a pardon, I'll take it. I want to stay, Violet. I want this life, our life, more than I've ever wanted anything. Then we'll make it happen, she whispered, sealing the promise with another kiss. Whatever the coming days might bring, they would face it together just as they had faced the fire that had first brought them together. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Sheriff Miller returned with cautiously hopeful news. The marshal's office was interested in Preston's information on the Carson gang and had not dismissed the possibility of a pardon. In the meantime, they were sending a deputy marshal to assist, though he wouldn't arrive for at least a week too late for the confrontation with Rollins, but perhaps in time to help capture Carson himself. The sheriff brought 3 deputies with him, steady men who set up camp near the house and took turns keeping watch. Preston spent hours with them, discussing strategy and planning for every contingency. Violet, meanwhile, made sure everyone was fed and prepared extra bandages and medicinal supplies, praying they wouldn't be needed but unwilling to be caught unprepared. She also practiced with her father's shotgun, determined to defend her home if necessary. On the night before Rollins was due to return, Violet found herself unable to sleep. The house was quiet, with Preston taking the first watch outside while Sheriff Miller and 1 deputy slept in the barn. The other 2 deputies were positioned at strategic points around the property. Throwing on a robe over her nightgown, Violet made her way to the porch. Preston sat in one of the wooden chairs, his rifle across his knees, Rusty alert at his feet. You should be sleeping, he said without turning around. I tried, Violet replied, sitting beside him. My mind wouldn't quiet. Preston reached over and took her hand. It will be all right, Violet. We're as prepared as we can be. I know, she said, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. I just keep thinking, what if this is our last night here together? What if tomorrow changes everything? He squeezed her hand. Tomorrow will change everything, one way or another, but we'll face it together." They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars and listening to the night sounds of the prairie. Finally, Preston spoke again, his voice low and thoughtful. "I've been thinking about what happens after. If we survive tomorrow, if I get this pardon." Violet turned to look at him, her heart quickening. Yes, in the moonlight she could see the vulnerability in his eyes. "I don't want to be just your hired hand anymore, Violet. I want to be your partner in every way if you'll have me." The simple, heartfelt proposal brought tears to her eyes. "Are you asking what I think you're asking, Preston Zachary?" A smile touched his lips. "Not very romantic timing, I know, but tomorrow's not guaranteed, and I wanted you to know I love you, Violet Lawson. I think I have since that first night when you insisted on saving your dog from the fire." Violet laughed softly through her tears. "And I love you, probably since you said we'll save him together." Preston leaned forward, kissing her with a tenderness that belied the calloused hands that cradled her face. "Is that a yes?" "Yes," Violet whispered against his lips. "1,000 times yes." The sound of a throat clearing made them spring apart. Sheriff Miller stood a few feet away, looking uncomfortable but not disapproving. "Sorry to interrupt," he said gruffly. "Came to relieve you, Zachary." Preston nodded, standing reluctantly. "All quiet so far." "Let's hope it stays that way," Miller replied, taking the chair Preston had vacated. "Both of you should get some rest. Tomorrow will be a long day." As they walked inside, Rusty trailing behind them, Violet felt a strange mixture of dread and hope. Whatever happened tomorrow, she knew that what she and Preston had found together was real and worth fighting for. Dawn broke with an eerie stillness, as if the prairie itself was holding its breath in anticipation. Preston and Violet shared a quiet breakfast with Sheriff Miller and his deputies, the men going over their plan one final time. "Remember," Miller said, addressing them all, "our goal is to take them alive if possible. Rollins and his men are our best chance at locating Carson and the rest of the gang." The men nodded their understanding, though Violet noticed Preston's jaw tighten. For him, this was personal in a way it wasn't for the others. By mid-morning, they had taken their positions. 2 deputies were hidden in the new barn. Sheriff Miller was concealed near the chicken coop, and the 3rd deputy was positioned behind a woodpile with a clear view of the approach to the house. Preston insisted on staying closest to Violet, who would wait inside with Rusty and her shotgun, appearing only when called. "Just like we discussed," Preston reminded her, checking his revolver one last time before taking up his position on the porch. "Stay inside, stay low, and only come out if I call for you." Violet nodded, fighting back fear. "Be careful." Preston's eyes softened. "Always am." They were ready, but as the morning stretched into afternoon, the waiting became its own kind of torture. Every distant sound made them tense. Every cloud of dust on the horizon heightened their vigilance. It was nearly 3 o'clock when Rusty suddenly growled, the hair on his back standing up. Violet peered cautiously through the window and saw them Rollins and 5 men, not the 3 who had come before, riding slowly toward the house. "They're here," she called softly to Preston, who nodded without turning. "I see them. Stay put." Violet watched as Preston stood tall on the porch, his posture relaxed but alert. Sheriff Miller and his deputies remained hidden, waiting for Preston's signal. "Zachary," Rollins called as they approached, "I see you didn't run. Smarter than I gave you credit for." "I've got your money, Rollins," Preston replied evenly. "All of it, just like you asked." The men reined in their horses a short distance from the porch. Rollins dismounted, his eyes scanning the quiet farmyard suspiciously. "Where's the woman?" "Gone to visit her sister," Preston lied smoothly. "Didn't want her involved in our business," Rollins smirked. "Considerate of you. Now the money." Preston reached slowly into his vest and withdrew an envelope. "It's all here. Count it if you want." "Oh, I will," Rollins assured him, approaching the porch with cautious steps. "Toss it down." Preston hesitated. "First, I want your word that this settles things. You and Carson leave me in this place alone for good." Rollins laughed. "You know better than that, Zach. Carson doesn't forgive betrayal." "But I'll tell you what, hand over the money, and I might just shoot you clean instead of taking you back for him to deal with personally." The casual threat sent a chill through Violet, but Preston's expression remained impassive. "Then I guess we have a problem." It happened in an instant, Preston dropping to one knee as Sheriff Miller's voice rang out. "U.S. Marshal, drop your weapons." The yard erupted in chaos. Two of Rollins' men immediately went for their guns, only to be shot by the deputies in the barn. Another tried to flee and was tackled by the deputy behind the woodpile. Rollins himself froze, then slowly raised his hands when he found himself staring down the barrel of Preston's revolver. The fifth man, however, spurred his horse straight toward the house, gun drawn. Before anyone could stop him, he fired several shots through the window where Violet stood watching. Glass shattered around her as she dropped to the floor, Rusty barking frantically beside her. Outside, she heard Preston's anguished shout, followed by more gunfire. Staying low, Violet crawled to her father's shotgun and positioned herself beside the shattered window. The rider was circling back, preparing for another pass at the house. Without hesitation, she raised the shotgun and fired. The blast caught the horse in the flank, causing it to rear in panic. The rider was thrown, landing hard on the packed earth of the yard. Before he could recover, Sheriff Miller was on him, disarming and restraining him with practiced efficiency. In the sudden silence that followed, Violet heard Preston calling her name, his voice ragged with fear. "I'm all right." She called back, standing carefully. "I'm not hit." Relief washed over Preston's face as he saw her in the doorway, shotgun still clutched in her hands. Then his expression hardened as he turned back to Rollins, who was now kneeling in the dirt, hands bound behind him. "Where's Carson?" Preston demanded. Rollins spat at his feet. "Go to hell, Zachary." Sheriff Miller stepped forward. "You're in a world of trouble, Rollins. Murder, attempted murder, robbery, that's a hanging offense. But cooperate, tell us where to find Carson, and maybe, just maybe, you'll live to see the inside of a prison instead of the end of a rope." Violet watched the internal struggle play out on Rollins' face, defiance warring with self-preservation. Finally, he slumped in defeat. "There's a hideout," he muttered. "Canyon about 40 miles northwest of here. Carson's planning a big job, the Army payroll, coming through Benton next week." Sheriff Miller nodded to his deputies. "Get them secured in the wagon. We'll take them to the jail in Clearwater tonight, then head for Benton tomorrow." As the deputies led the prisoners away, Preston rushed to Violet, gathering her in a fierce embrace. "I thought, when I heard the shots." His voice broke. "I'm fine," she assured him, clinging just as tightly. "We're both fine." Preston pulled back to examine her face, his eyes dark with emotion. "You were supposed to stay down and let him take another shot at my house," Violet challenged, a spark of her usual spirit returning. "I think not." A reluctant smile tugged at Preston's mouth. "Remind me never to get on your bad side, Miss Lawson." Their moment was interrupted by Sheriff Miller, who approached with a thoughtful expression. "That was good shooting, Miss Lawson, and quick thinking, Zachary." He hesitated, then added, "Rollins' information about Carson is valuable." "Very valuable. I'll make sure the marshal knows who it came from." Preston nodded, his arms still around Violet's shoulders. "Thank you, Sheriff." "Don't thank me yet," Miller cautioned. "There's still the matter of Carson himself, and your pardon isn't guaranteed, but—" He glanced between them, his expression softening slightly. "I'll put in a good word, for what it's worth." After the sheriff and his deputies departed with their prisoners, Preston and Violet stood in the sudden quiet of their yard, surveying the aftermath. Two of Rollins' men were dead, their bodies loaded onto the wagon with the living prisoners. Blood stained the earth where they had fallen, and the broken glass from the window glittered in the late afternoon sun. "What happens now?" Violet asked, leaning against Preston's solid presence. He sighed, his eyes on the horizon. "We wait. The marshal will want my full testimony about Carson, and there's no telling how long it will take for a decision on the pardon. But in the meantime, you're here," Violet said, looking up at him. "With me." Preston smiled down at her, his expression tender despite the strain of the day. "Yes, with you." As the sun began to set, they stood together on the porch, the cowboy who had once been an outlaw and the woman who had believed in his redemption, watching as the prairie was bathed in golden light. Rusty lay at their feet, occasionally thumping his tail against the wooden boards as if to remind them that he was still there, still faithful. "You know," Preston said thoughtfully, "when I first saw your dog barking at the fire's edge that night, I never imagined where it would lead." Violet smiled, remembering. "And when you said we'll save him together, I never dreamed we'd end up here." Preston pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "No regrets, not one," she assured him, turning in his arms to face him fully. "Whatever comes next, Preston Zachary, we'll face it together." And as his lips met hers in a kiss that held both promise and passion, Violet knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they had already found something rare and precious, a love forged in fire and tested in battle, strong enough to withstand whatever the future might bring. 5 months later, as the first snow of winter dusted the Nebraska prairie, Violet stood at the window of her kitchen, watching Preston chop wood in the yard. Rusty bounded through the snow nearby, occasionally picking up sticks and dropping them at Preston's feet, much to the man's apparent amusement. So much had changed since that day in June when Rawlins and his men had come to their door. The information Preston provided had led to the capture of Carson himself, along with most of his gang, during their attempted robbery of the Army payroll. The U.S. Marshal had been so pleased with the outcome that he had personally recommended Preston for a full pardon, which had been granted just last month. Sheriff Miller had become an unlikely ally, visiting often enough that Violet now considered him a friend. He had even stood as witness at their small wedding in September, alongside Mrs. Anderson and Dr. Green. The broken window had been replaced, the blood washed from the yard by summer rains, and the barn now housed not only livestock but a fine new wagon Preston had purchased for Violet as a wedding gift. Their cornfields had yielded a bountiful harvest, enough to see them comfortably through the winter with plenty to sell in town. But the greatest change, Violet reflected as she unconsciously rested a hand on her still flat stomach, was yet to come. She hadn't told Preston yet, wanting to be certain before sharing the news that would make their family complete. Dr. Green had confirmed it just yesterday during his monthly visit to check on patients too far from town to come to his office. She was expecting their first child, due in early summer. The sound of boots stomping on the porch roused her from her thoughts. Preston entered, his cheeks reddened from the cold, carrying an armload of firewood. "Should be enough to keep us warm tonight," he said, depositing the wood in the box beside the stove. "Storms coming in from the north." "Might be a bad one," Violet smiled, handing him a cup of hot coffee. "Then I'm glad I have you to keep me warm." Preston's eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled back, accepting the cup. "Always." As he shed his coat and gloves, Violet took a deep breath, deciding that this moment, quiet, ordinary, perfect, was the right one for her news. "Preston," she began, her voice soft but steady, "I have something to tell you." He turned to her, instantly alert to the significance in her tone. "What is it?" Violet took his hand and placed it gently over her middle. "We're going to have a baby, next summer." For a moment, Preston simply stared, his expression one of stunned disbelief. Then a slow smile spread across his face, transforming it with joy. "A baby." He whispered, as if saying it too loudly might make it untrue. "We're going to have a baby," Violet nodded, her own eyes filling with happy tears. "Dr. Green confirmed it yesterday. Are you pleased?" In answer, Preston swept her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in a gentle but exuberant embrace. "Pleased, Violet, there aren't words." He set her down carefully, as if she might break. "Are you feeling all right? Should you be resting? Do you need anything?" Laughing through her tears, Violet placed a hand on his cheek. "I'm perfectly fine. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, you know." Preston covered her hand with his own. "Not my woman, not my child." His voice was thick with emotion. "I never thought I'd have this, Violet. A home, a wife, a child on the way. It's more than I ever dreamed possible." "You deserve it all," she assured him, "and more." As they stood together in their warm kitchen, Rusty snoozing by the stove and snow falling softly outside, Violet marveled at how far they had come from that desperate night when her dog had barked at the fire's edge, and a stranger had offered help. Life on the frontier would never be easy. There would be harsh winters and dry summers, illness and hardship, challenges that would test them time and again. But there would also be moments like this one filled with love and hope and the promise of a future brighter than either of them could have imagined. "I love you, Preston Zachary," Violet murmured, resting her head against his chest, his arms tightened around her, strong and protective. "And I love you, Violet Zachary, you and our child more than life itself." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing their farm in pristine white. But inside, the fire burned warm and bright, a symbol of the love that had brought them together, and the life they would continue to build, side by side, for all the years to come.